Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to welcome back Micaela Procopio. Micaela is the digital educator for the U.S. Army Women's Museum. Since January 2021, Micaela has been responsible for running the virtual programs for schools and organizations across the United States. She has also created a new program for the museum, including Spies in Disguise, Soldiers in Skirts, and No Male, Low Morale on the women of the 688th. Micaela has a BA in History from Michigan State University and a Master's in Public History from the American University. She is currently a PhD candidate studying the history of the Holocaust at Gratz College. Today's program is titled Island of Integration, the Desegregation of the U.S. Army. As our nation fought abroad in World War II, the stirrings of another fight were beginning at home. Follow the journey of African American women as desegregation begins in the U.S. Army. Witness the history being made at home and abroad by examining original photographs, documents, newspapers, and artifacts. This story will carry us from Fort Des Moines, Iowa in 1942 to Camp Lee in Virginia in 1952. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Micaela.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. Please let me know if you have any questions or if I can speak louder or if there's any technical difficulties. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. This is the front of our building, the U.S. Army Women's Museum, where I work. We are the only museum in the world that is dedicated to telling the stories of women in the Army, particularly. So even though we have other branches of our military, they might just have a broad museum dedicated to their branch and not one specifically about the contributions of women. So we're going to talk today specifically about the contributions of women in the Women's Army Corps during World War II and how during the development of the Women's Army Corps, they progressed towards integration kind of well before what we think of that time. So we're going to start with this photo. I'll also sometimes pose questions, so feel free to use the raise hand icon or just put it in the chat so I can see. We're going to start with this photo. And when we came across this photo in our archives, in our collections, it really kind of spurred an interesting query for us because we noticed something right away. And we were very curious about when this photo was taken. So I'm going to just kind of ask you, what do you see? What do you notice in this photo? Is there anything that really kind of stands out to you?
I see black and white.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly. It's a group of women. They're obviously in uniform, and they're marching down the street, and it is an integrated group of women. It's black and white women marching together. And so we were really curious about the date and time that this photo was taken. This photo was taken on Sycamore Street in the town of Petersburg, Virginia, which if you're familiar with your Civil War history, you might recognize. Petersburg is right next to the military base, so where Fort Lee is. And this photo was taken during an Armed Forces Day parade in 1951. And 1951 was really interesting to us because we kind of know in our other history that it wasn't until 1954 that Brown versus the Board of Education happened, or 1955 when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. And in 1959, schools in Prince Edward County, Virginia, decide to close their doors rather than desegregate. And so what we have is years before all of that, we have an integrated group of black and white WACs marching down the street together in a town that we know is not going to be very open to the idea of integration. And so we wondered what got to this point, what led us to the point of this photo. So to do that, we're going to go back a little bit, and I'm actually going to have us start with this video, if it plays, which it should. So we're going to go back to World War II. Right. So when World War II happens and the United States gets involved, it is very quickly a two-front war. And the need for men to fight is large, it's drastic, and the United States puts out a call for women. And women will join in all sorts of ways. First as factories, as Rosie the Riveters, and then very quickly that's going to change and something called the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps will be created. But what we're going to do is I'm going to show you this video. It's about 30 seconds long, and it is put out by the United States military, and it has a very specific message that it is sending out to the American public. And I want us to kind of see if we can figure out, what is this specific message.
On every front, the men of America are carrying on our fight for freedom. And back of them is another army, a woman's army, the Woman's Army Corps, the WACs. Women from every walk of life, of every race, creed, and color. Women who have recognized their stake in the future of America. They carry no arms, and their work is far behind the fighting line. But for every WAC volunteer, another soldier is released for combat duty. Another weapon turned against the Axis.
Okay, perfect. So it's very short again, right? It's about 30 seconds long, and it has a couple of really interesting things that it talks about in the message, right? It has kind of a clear goal of what the women are supposed to do. The Women's Army Corps, it is going to stay behind the fighting lines. For every woman that joins up, it frees up a man to fight, right? Women of every race, creed, and color are going to be kind of put into this new Women's Army Corps. Yes, women stay behind the scenes. Exactly. I think that's so important, right? They want their help in certain support roles, but they are not going to be anywhere near the front lines. Oops, sorry, we'll move on to the next slide. So when the Women's Army Corps is officially established in 1942, it is established as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And very quickly, not even a year later, the Army ends up dropping the auxiliary and they become the Women's Army Corps. And the point of dropping the auxiliary means that this essentially redefines the scope of what the Women's Army Corps can do. It becomes more like a regular Army structure. Women will have the same ranks and the same pay structure as men, right? So the pay structure is important. Equal pay is not the same thing as the same pay structure. So in World War II, however, we have a racially segregated army, and at the same time, African-American men and women are still willing to serve. For the African-American community, there is something called the Double V campaign, and this emphasizes that the Blacks in World War II are fighting for two victories, one abroad and one at home, right? This fight to end racial discrimination. In this letter from the NAACP, it points to the slackening of policy of segregation at the WAC Training Center in Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and really encourages Black women to join the Women's Army Corps. However, there is a quota system put in place by the military that says only 2% of the entire Army can be women, and of that 2%, only 10% of them can be Black women. These women will nickname themselves the 10%ers. You might recognize two of these ladies up here in the right. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, and Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the only African-American woman in Roosevelt's administration, worked together to ensure that Black women would be in the Women's Army Corps from its very first establishment. The Army, however, argues that they cannot undertake a program of major social change, such as desegregation, in a time of war. But they say we will kind of take steps to show you that we are interested in progressing integration. And they mandate that Black and whites will train together at Officer Candidate School in 1942 and in Specialist Technical Schools in 1943. So the first officer candidate class of women is 440 women. Of those 440, 40 of them are Black. Many of these women were actually handpicked by Mary McLeod Bethune, and they will go on to shape and lead the Black WAC forces of World War II. So this other picture we have, this is some of that first officer candidate school class, and you can see within this that there are women and there are also Black women. And I'm going to talk to you right now about a couple of these women in the first OCS class. We're going to start with Major Harriet West Waddy. Harriet West is one of this first officer candidate school graduates, and she is actually assigned to the Personnel Division in Washington, D.C., specifically to oversee minority needs. She works very closely with the WAC director at the time, Ovetta Culp-Hobby, and she goes on to serve as a recruiter and an inspector of race relations for Black women in the Army. And this is really significant because this tells us that there's an entire job dedicated to kind of collecting this information, collecting this data. And Waddy was really gathering crucial information about the working conditions in the Army for Black women. She traveled all over the country, interviewing WACs and assessing their situations. Her original reports are in the archives here at our museum, along with her personal collection. Next, we have Major Charity Adams and the women of the 6888. She is one of my favorites. She's very cool. By the end of World War II, over 6,500 Black women had served in the Women's Army Corps. One distinguished unit, the 6888 Postal Battalion, was even deployed to Europe despite the ban on Black women being sent overseas. And that's important because when the Women's Army Corps is created, right, if we think back to that video, they have a very specific job, right? They're behind the scenes. They're going to pick up what we generally refer to in the Army as support roles, right? It's very different now, but back then, the Army realizes that if women can take on these support roles like clerking, administration, filing, that this really frees up men to do the actual fighting and will thus end the war quicker. They also realize that this idea that they will have the Women's Army Corps stay entirely in the United States is not going to last, considering the amount of manpower World War II is going to require. And so white women will be allowed to serve overseas, but there is a ban placed on Black women until pretty much the end of the war, when there is a major backlog of mail in the European theater of operations, and the Army had sent a couple of previous units to clear out this backlog of mail, and they had failed. And so they placed Charity Adams in charge of this postal battalion, and they will be sent over to Europe in the spring of 1945 to attempt to clear out this backlog of mail. Major Charity Adams is one of those first OCS class graduates, and we have her uniform on display at our museum. These 800 women, which are all Black women, are stationed first in Birmingham, England, and then eventually on to Paris. The battalion was responsible for the redirection of mail to over 7 million US personnel in the European theater of operations. They worked 3 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week, to clear out the tremendous backlog of Christmas mail. Each shift averaged 65,000 pieces of mail. The 6888 earned themselves a great amount of respect for their hard work and dedication. Unfortunately, they didn't really get the recognition they deserved until recently, which I think in 2022, they were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. This is Charity Adams again, receiving her promotion. I just love this newspaper clipping because I think what is relevant is her face. This is just a facial expression that we see on people in all branches of the military when they get a promotion. It's not unique to just one person. And of course, Harriet West Waddy is here too. She is pinning one of the bars onto Charity Adams. After the war, there's actually a dramatic drawdown of the WAC, especially among Black WACs. While reenlistment is open to Black women after the war in 1946 and 1947, the primary attraction of being stationed overseas was not. Within a few years, only 4 Black WAC officers and 121 enlisted women remained on active duty. Nevertheless, important Army officials such as General Eisenhower and General Marshall saw the need to establish a permanent Women's Army Corps. It took several years, but on June 12, 1948, President Truman signed into law a measure that placed women in both the regular reserves and the regular Army during a time of peace. A month later, in July, he issues Executive Order 9981, mandating an end to racial discrimination and segregation in the armed forces. Of course, we know that just because he mandates an end to it does not mean that it ends immediately, but it means that now there is actually a law that will require the Army to start progressing towards integration. These photos, or this photo on the left, is taken in October of 1948. Camp Lee, as it's known at the time, is selected as the home of the first permanent WAC training center. This meant that every woman who joined the Army between 1948 and 1954 would be trained at Camp Lee. So every single woman that joins the Women's Army Corps will have to go through this particular military base. The photo on the right is taken a year later in October 1949. This is Captain Bernice Hughes, and she is assigned as the first commanding officer of B Company. Even though this executive order that I talked about had been issued in July of 1948, when the WAC Training Center was officially opened at Camp Lee, the 10% quota for Black women was still in place. And it resulted in Army recruiters sending Black enlistees to the center during every 5th training increment. And this means that they all ended up being placed in Company B. And so they were all trained by Black officers and non-commissioned officers. So we see that they're still not integrating. There's a loophole that has been found. Although separate facilities like the recreation, barracks were required, the historical record tells us that the women at the WAC Training Center often defied these social norms. And we'll talk a little bit about why we think that was. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, no, perfect. In January of 1949, women would march for the first time in an inaugural parade. So the WACs from Camp Lee were invited to march for President Truman in Washington, D.C. And so instead of sending just one company to represent the training center, they decided to send representatives from every company, which meant that Black and white women would be marching down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. together as an integrated unit. This photo is very significant. It's taken in April 1949, and it shows the impact of the Women's Armed Service Integration Act when Omar Bradley, who is this man right here, Chief of Staff of the Army, and Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers, who is behind him, are present at the graduation of the first OCS class into the regular Army. 2 of those 67 graduates in that first class are Black women. This image is taken and then it is sent out to news organizations across the country. And that's really important because the Army is basically saying to the media, hey, look, we're starting to integrate. And also that the Women's Army Corps is a permanent part of the Army and that Black women are going to be a part of that permanence. This is Vernetta Jones. She happens to be in the last segregated class of clerks to be trained at Camp Lee. She lives up the road in Richmond, Virginia, and remembers her time at Camp Lee very well. The WAC Training Center was happy to see segregation end in April of 1950. Approval of the new policy was obvious from a comment in the center's historical report for the quarter, which read, We noted the change in the Army's system of segregation as we welcomed the last Company B into WAC clerical training course for MOS 405 clerk typist. When the quota was finally eliminated in January 1950, segregation still remained for the men in basic training. But for the women at Camp Lee, the end of the quota meant the official end of segregation. Local and national newspapers start noting the changes that are occurring at Camp Lee. One newspaper proclaimed the WAC Training Center as an island of integration in an otherwise sea of segregation. In both training and recreation, WACs from the newly renamed Fort Lee disregarded racial barriers. Fort Lee was indeed an island in an area where the local high school would not integrate until 1970, and where Prince William County would defund its public schools to prevent African American children from attending. This newspaper's, one of its subheadlines reads, WAC unit does not conform to the pattern set by the rest of the fort. And this tells us that the men of Fort Lee have not yet integrated. And so we have to think about a couple of reasons of why we think this is. And I mentioned that earlier, right? Why did women disregard these separate facilities? Large numbers of people make it harder to make a change, right? We have to remember that there's a small subsection of women that are allowed into the Army at this time. And that for the men, there's a much larger number of men that are in the Army at this point in time. Women already feel like a minority, right? We do have to acknowledge that for Black women, they had this double-edged sword of not only being a woman, but they were also Black. But for their white counterparts, women were generally not welcomed into the Army. It was not a change that many people were happy with. They did not think that women should be in the military. And so I think it was a little easier for women to band together when there was this general consensus that women did not belong there. And then the way that the installations were populated, right? So we have to remember that for a couple of years, every single woman that joined the Army had to go through the same place, right? They were all housed at Camp Lee. And so this is much easier to make a change when you're all in the same place versus all of the men that are spread out across the country. And then this essentially takes us back to the very image that we started with, right? We've gone through a very brief history of the kind of desegregation that is happening in the military. But now that we've had this kind of brief history and this brief background, we can come back and look to this picture and think about what is happening in Fort Lee at this time, of the steps that have kind of taken to get women to march as an integrated unit down the street in Virginia, in a town that is not going to be quite open to integration. And then before I take questions, about a year ago, Fort Lee was one of the 9 Southern bases that was up to have its name rechanged, to not have the name of a Confederate general. And so the Fort Lee was renamed. It is now Fort Greg Adams, and it is named after 2 Black Army members, General Arthur Gregg, who was the first 3-star Black general in the Quartermaster Corps, and Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams, who I mentioned very briefly as the leader of the 688. And so Fort Lee is now named after these 2 kind of trailblazers who really helped shape the way for Black men and women to be a part of an integrated Army. So it's a very short program, but if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them. If you're interested in Army Women's History, you can follow us on Facebook. We also take research requests. If you go to our website, you can fill out a research or an archival request there. We are the largest depository of archival records related to women that have served in the Army specifically. And then if you're also interested in the name changes of these military installations, I'm happy to send you a link about the naming commission. And I will go ahead and stop my share. And if we have any questions, I will take them now.
Okay, class, if you will unmute your microphones and ask Micaela any question you might have.
Yes, I noticed in the picture with the general shaking, extending his hand to shake it, were there additional pictures where he's actually shaking her hand, and were they made public?
You're talking about the one with Omar Bradley, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, let me go back. I have to look at this photo. Yes, so there are photos, they're in our archival collection. The reason we use this one is because this is the one that is the best image. It's not as blurry. And then we don't have a picture. Actually, this is a very interesting story, so I'm glad that you caught onto it. We don't actually have a picture of the other Black graduate. We have just this one specifically, and we use this image because this is the one that was circulated out to the media. So this is the one that you can find in newspapers, you know, if you search that. But we do in our collection have the photos of them shaking hands, him shaking her hand, and also her shaking Congresswoman Rogers' hand. I don't know, or we don't know why, you know, this image was the one that was circulated. I'm assuming because it's, you know, the best quality, the best like still footage. But I think you bring up a very, you know, interesting point of the fact that his hand is outstretched, but they're not actually shaking hands. And so I don't know if the other photos were circulated, if they were probably just kept by the Army Signal Corps, because that's generally who took most of the photos at this time. And it's probably just in some interesting collections like ours. But I'm very glad that you noticed that, right? It's not something that I generally think about when I present this program because we're just going through, but you're right, he's not shaking her hand, and there's probably a lot of interesting ways that we can read into the way that the photo is posed, you know, why that photo, why was it sent out, right?
Yeah, and to me, she looks somewhat hesitant.
Yes. Yeah. Omar Bradley had a very interesting reputation in the Army. He was very, very strict. We actually have a survivor, or not a survivor, a WAC testimony, a veteran testimony of a WAC who worked with General Eisenhower after the war. She worked in his office, and she talked a lot about Omar Bradley and just kind of his personality, his characteristics. And I think you kind of have to remember that there were not a lot of higher up Army officials that were very happy with this opening of women into the Army. For all like the positivity of this program that we present and how progressive we make it sound like the Army is, we have all of those contradictions as well, right? That they were very not happy about this Women's Army Corps, that many, many men in the Army really protested it, that they were against it, that many of them were unhappy when Truman kind of issued them as part of a permanent presence in the Army Corps. And the fact that they keep it as the Women's Army Corps for so long is significant too, because that was kind of marketed as an appeasement, right? They're going to be a part of the Army, but they're not in the Army, right? They will be in a separate Women's Army Corps. They won't go into the regular Army. So I think you can probably see that there. Many of the women were very aware that they were treading into a ground that was unfamiliar territory, and one that the general public was not happy about, and one that many people in the military were not happy about either.
I have a question. were the women given the same benefits as veterans as the males?
Yes and no. So it depends. So women in the Women's Army Corps were given some benefits, some veterans benefits, like the GI Bill was open to them. And many women who joined the Women's Army Corps did so for the fact that they would get the GI Bill, and many of them used it afterwards and went on to attend college and have very remarkable careers that helped progress the United States further. And this is very specific for the Women's Army Corps because they were considered a military unit. By contrast, what we think of as, the WASP, right? The Women Air Force Service pilots, they were given nothing because they were considered contractors, right? They were considered not a part of the Army or the Air Force. So they had a whole different type of pay. They didn't follow the same pay structure or the ranks, and they were not even considered veteran status until I think Jimmy Carter changed that in his presidency. So it really depends. We can kind of see it all sorts of different ways, right? Same with the waves, the women that were kind of considered the part of the Navy. We have all of these sorts of discrepancies. And even though the Army sounds progressive, right? They adopt this same rank and same pay structure. There are still different rules, right? For many years in the Women's Army Corps, you did not get the same pension. You could not serve in the Women's Army Corps if you were married or if you were with child. If you were even 18, you had to get your parents' permission to join the Women's Army Corps. I think you could join up without your parents' permission if you were 21 or older. And you also had an age limit, like if you were over 30, the Women's Army Corps didn't want you because there was, something considered wrong with you if you were still single at 30. So we have all of those little tiny contradictions too.
What about after the war was over? What about I know a lot of veterans, they have the right to be buried in a military cemetery. Were the women also?
Yes, but I don't know if that happened directly after World War II. There are women that are buried in a military cemetery, but I believe that any women that died in World War II is not, because there was different criteria. I'd have to look. I don't know the exact answer. But many women in these military units did not die in World War II through combat, right? Because they're not necessarily on these support lines. So they weren't considered to be achieving the same status as men. I'd have to look. I know we have it about the first woman that was buried in a military cemetery. But I'm not sure. So that one story that I do know is that there were a couple of women in the 6888 that were killed over in Europe. But they were killed in an automobile accident, not in battle. And so they're actually buried at a military cemetery in France. But that is different rules in France than obviously in the United States. So I'd have to look at it. So I'm not exactly sure.
I have a two-part question. On your website, you mentioned in your presentation that you are the largest repository for records pertaining to the Women's Army Corps or women who served in the Army Corps. I'm assuming NARA might have. My question is, do you have finding aids? And then secondly, it states on the website that the research room is closed to the public. Are there any provisions to conduct research there, either for personal inquiry or for scholarly research?
Yes. So, okay. So, you mentioned NARA, briefly. I'm going to talk about it. So the reason that we have the largest one and not NARA is because NARA's, department that held their collection of women military records, actually caught fire in the 70s, I think, and the majority of their records, burned down. And so unfortunately they're kind of lost to history. The reason that we don't really have a finding aid is because a couple of parts. We're a government military museum, so we have, different guidelines, policies than if we were, the National Records Administration or a Smithsonian archive or something like that. So we don't have an online digital repository that you can look at. That's due in part to that we don't have either the funding for it or we don't have the staff to complete it. However, we are open, for research requests, family research, scholarly research, all of the above. We just have a different kind of process for how that looks. So the reading room isn't just generally open to the public. You'd have to make an appointment. So generally what happens is that you would send a request on the website. I think it has the email or the contact. If not, I'll drop it in the chat. And you would just say, I attended a digital program. I'm interested in conducting research on women in Vietnam regarding this, or I have this particular woman in my family history that I know served in Afghanistan, and I'm interested if you have records in that. And so what would happen is we'd get your request, and either one of the staff or our volunteers would go into our archival room and would search and come back and say, oh, we have this amount of information on this woman. And we would either scan it to you over email, or we would make an appointment for you to come into the museum and view all of the documentation or artifacts that we have on that specific topic or that individual or person. The reason that it's a little different is that we have a full-time staff of 3. So, our director, our collections person, and then our education team. So it's not going to operate necessarily the same way, but we will work with you with whatever flexibility or tools that we have to help you access our materials.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a photo it's from my husband's parents' photo album. I'm trying to remember. And it's a woman in uniform,
Mhm.
and I don't know who she is. So I'm wondering if there's a way to help identify who she might, well, at least where she might be involved, a nurse or whatever, by her uniform.
Definitely. So if you're able, to scan or take a digital scan of the image and email it to us, seeing the uniform is helpful. That's actually also very helpful because the women's Army uniform changed over the years, and it tells us a little bit about it, the insignia, and that might help us, pinpoint it down to year, what conflict it was near. Also specifically because, after World War II to Vietnam, there were only a few places that women could actually be stationed. So that narrows it down a little bit more so than men. But I'm gonna put my email. So this is our email, our education email. Usually I answer that. If you want to fill out a research request, you can use the contact form on the website as well, but just be patient with us because of our small staff. It takes us a little longer to get into the archives. We're definitely happy to look at the photo and see if we can help narrow it down or pinpoint that for you. That would be very interesting.
Thank you. Now I'll have to go look for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Micaela, I know that there are many books that have been published on men's uniforms and how they've changed over the years in the military. To your knowledge, have there been any books published on women's uniforms?
No, to my knowledge, not really. There's a couple, books that have come out recently. Like I think the most well-known one about women in the Army was Women Who Stepped Out of Line, which talks about, some different positions that women did in World War II or in the Army. To my knowledge, there's not one about women's uniforms. They are constantly like changing. Like in our collections, we have the actual like Army orders of uniform changing in the process to read, which is very interesting. But as far as I know, there's not like a specific academic or nonfiction book that is written on women's uniforms changing, which would be very interesting. I usually try to talk about it in my programs because I find it fascinating. So maybe in my spare time, I'll write it.
I will say that the official U.S. Army Green Book series history of women in the Women's Army Corps in World War II, I mean, it's over 1,000 or 700 and something pages. Anyway, it talks extensively about the complications associated with the uniforms, conflicts between services and supply, not having the right materials, different theaters. So if you have it on a digital download, it's easy to do a keyword search, and that might be helpful if somebody wants to know a history of the uniform. It was a hot mess. So there were a lot of challenges.
Yeah, sorry, that was very helpful. Like the Army Green books, definitely. I was thinking more, like public, but you're absolutely right. The Army Green books are chock full of all of the things with uniforms. I mean, you can go into later ones and you can read about the mess with uniforms during the Vietnam War was also a large mess as well. I mean, it's still a large mess. It wasn't until like the 2000s that the Army finally adopted a Army uniform for pregnant women. The standard before adopting like a maternity uniform was if you could no longer fit into your uniform, you had to go on maternity leave. And so, that finally changed, I think, in like the early 2000s. So, sometimes the Army is a little slow. So sometimes they take their time.
For those of us who don't have a real, deep understanding of the military, can you kind of explain to the class exactly what the green books are?
Sure, I have to refresh my brain. So it's basically it's like the Army's official history of different things that they were in. I'll also put in the chat. So one thing that's helpful is the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And so this is definitely where you will find kind of the downloadables. I'll put it in there. It's basically in the World War II series, which is their official history of the Second World War, are commonly referred to as green books. And they're called green books because the covers of the books are green, is basically it. And this would just have like rules, regulations, kind of like the nitty-gritty. So here's I put in the chat, here's kind of the link, which you can go back, you can look at the Army's Center for Military History in more that way. If you want to go on to it, they have, you can read in different sections like the War Department, different things, different records, and it'll talk about, different uniforms, progresses, standards, policy procedures. And you can also go back and just look at the Center of Military History's like series and collections. And so this is going to be everything. This would be, different wars, different Army campaigns, things like that. But the green books are specifically for World War II, if that helps.
Now, because our class is, specifically on genealogy, and we're always interested in knowing more about the research process, and since your stacks are kind of closed to the public, can you kind of walk us through when you get an inquiry? Yeah, let's say somebody's looking for their female ancestor who served in World War II. Kind of walk the class through your research process. What do you do to find the answer?
So if we get a research request, generally, usually our collections person manages it, and then it's usually run by our volunteer archivist who is in usually 2 days a week. So when we get a research request that goes through, we use our own finding aid on our computer, which is hooked up to our own digital database system. And so the way that that's set up is when there was a collections department, when we go through and organize it, it's organized into a couple of different ways. It's organized either by like topic, so war, the specific conflict, so Revolution, Civil War, War of 1812, also organized by other topics, the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurse Corps, uniforms, paratroopers, different topics like that. And then we have a finding aid that is listed to every individual that we have documentation of. So any document that comes in that cites a specific woman, we cross-reference through basically their ID or their dog tag, so their military number. And that will go through our computer that will say, yes, you have this much on this individual, it's in box yada yada under this topic, or it's in box 53A and it's also in box that, and then you can go through and look in the papers and find if there's a thing. Sometimes it's just one mention, like maybe they're mentioned in their hometown local newspaper, and so we have that. Generally, if we put it into our system and nothing pops up, that just means that we don't have that individual documented, and that just means that we have gaps. Generally the gaps are due to a family history that was never given to the museum. It was never given as like a donation or an archival collection. It might mean that their record was lost when there was the fire at the NARA archives, and it's gone. Usually if someone comes across it or they say, oh, my great aunt served in this and this was her dog tag, and here's her number and we have all of these photos, is she in your system? We can look and say, no, she's not in our system. Would you consider making a donation? And then we add it to our repository. We also cross-reference too. We have like subscriptions to newspapers, Ancestry, things like that. And so we will also cross-reference an individual name that way as well. Yes, you're right. The green in the chat, sorry, I'll just talk about that too. The green book is also commonly known or referred to about books that showed hotels, places where African Americans could travel in the American South. The Army Green Book is called the Green Book because it's just green, because the green is the color of like the Army uniforms. So hopefully that helps a little bit on the way our collections work individually. It's not a great answer because it's an ever-growing collection. Like 2 years ago, we added documents to our individual collection for a WAC veteran who served during World War II and was an advisor to General Eisenhower and worked with Omar Bradley. And she was not in our collection because, we just didn't know. And we found out about her because we did a digital program at her senior center where she lived. And someone said, oh, Esther was a WAC. And we said, oh, really? And we got in touch with her family and we did an oral history interview with her. And then upon her passing, the family donated some of her papers, but, not all of them. And so then she goes into our record as well. And generally what we do in our archive that is a little different is we don't always have everything because this is family history, and oftentimes descendants will come in and they'll look at our collection and they might be willing to part with some things and not other things because, the individual or the service member who served, that is a large part of their family history. And so we always want to keep the family's interest and what they're comfortable with at the front of our mind. So we're always happy to add, people to our database so that we have the record. But that also, that's a very specific part of your family history and who you are. And so we are happy to collect those stories and share it, but we only want people to donate things that they are comfortable with parting, or oftentimes we'll do it on loan, or we'll take a digital photo of it to go into our digital record. But we always want people to keep their own family histories and stories that are important and special to them. And we always appreciate when people share that part of their family legacy with us. So a little bit long-winded answer, but I'm hopeful that it helped out a little bit. Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, I love hearing you know, where people's family members served. And the other thing that I think is a little bit hard in collecting women's stories, especially, you know, in that World War II generation, is they're very much a generation that is, you know, I did what I had to do for my country and it wasn't a big deal. And they have that very specific attitude and outlook on that. And so oftentimes it can be harder to collect those stories because, you know, they don't talk about that period as well.
One of the things we talk about frequently in this class is there's sometimes a disconnect between generations, where things that an older generation values not necessarily do the younger generation value. A good example would be like China. You know, when you inherit your grandma's China, you know, grandma went to mom, mom goes to daughter, but then maybe granddaughter doesn't want that China. And I would think that military, you know, ephemera and heirlooms would kind of fit into that same category. Sometimes, you know, it's more important to the mother than it is to the granddaughter, you know, of the veteran. So do you see this often, and how do you encourage people who maybe the younger generation doesn't want the military memorabilia that's left over from prior generations? Should they contact you and donate those items?
Yeah, so you can contact through our website. We'll generally, you know, go through our collections and see what it's interesting. Again, there are, like, we don't promise that we'll take anything. So, you know, things that are more common, like if you have a uniform, we might have a lot of that one military uniform and we might not need another one to our collection. We're more interested in like specific family stories. So we've been collecting recently a lot of descendants of women that were in the 688 have come to visit our museum and have ended up, you know, donating some things that they didn't realize was important. So we had someone donate recently a hot rod, like heating comb, that Black women generally would have used. And it will go on display in our new temporary exhibit that's going up. And when they talked about it, you know, they didn't, they weren't sure, you know, they were like, they were ready to give it to us. And then when we were like so excited about it, they were like, oh, well, maybe, you know, we should keep it. And then eventually they left with the hot comb, and then they came back and they were like, no, you know, we want to donate it. We want it to go on display so people can see and understand this history of, like, you know, beauty products and things that were important to women in the military. And even specifically what this was like, you know, for Black women that had to follow these beauty standards that were a little different and required maybe more work or effort than their white counterparts. So that's one example. We had another family that her mom was a Black WAC and she was stationed in France. And while she was in France, a German POW made her a jewelry box. Like he made her like a wooden box, and it had a design and an etching on it. And we were really interested in seeing, you know, the jewelry box, and we saw it and they were like, we don't want to part with this. It's so important. And we said, absolutely, we understand. But that was a case where we were able to take, you know, a very high res digital photo of it, and the photo will go up in our exhibit. So, and it's a little bit different ways. Like Charity Adams's children eventually came to visit the museum, and we went to their home and went through their mom's collection. And there were some things that they wanted to donate and other things that they didn't want to keep or didn't realize. So they also donated to us their mother's wartime diary. So it's like her military journal where she talks about her different days or her troops. It's her command journal that she basically used to then write her memoir. And it was something that, you know, her kids didn't really think was that important, that they like didn't really, you know, care about. But then when we got to it, we were like, this is so fascinating. Like she talks about all of these things in the military. So it really depends. It depends on the person, the family, and the things that are interesting. And obviously, like they said, you know, the love and interest that we have for the command journal is going to be a better educational tool, and we will use it more in our outreach efforts than they ever could. So it depends a little bit like that, but yes, you definitely can see the differences in the generational gaps. To the person about the photo, that's also interesting too, because in many places like World War I and World War II, women served in these civilian welfare organizations, even if they weren't a part of the military. So many of the women that served in World War I came in these other units with either the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the YMCA was even parts of that. Many women in the Red Cross were also there in World War II, and they, you know, did things like handing out donuts or snacks or things like that. So even if it's not necessarily a military uniform, it might still mean that she was there and involved in those things as well.
One of the things we do in our class is we really stress recording oral history, and the place that I always promote to store them is on StoryCorps. However, I heard that you mentioned that you have recorded some oral histories as well. Where are your oral histories stored, and are they publicly accessible?
They are not publicly accessible because we don't have a digital collection website like other major museums do, and that's generally just because we're part of the military. Some oral histories that we have are up on our YouTube channel, so you can look at them there. Generally, any oral histories that we have, we also cross-share with the Library of Congress. So if you're looking for any oral histories about female veterans, I would start with the Library of Congress, because anything that we have, we've shared with them. So it would be easier for you to access them from the Library of Congress versus going through us.
Okay, yeah, and I noticed that somebody just put in the chat box, I recently read Goodnight Irene about the donut dollies. First time I'd ever heard about them. Interesting that you would mention them.
I love the donut dollies. It's one of my favorite stories. The donut dollies were a part of one of those civilian welfare organizations that I mentioned that actually was stationed overseas in World War I as part of the Salvation Army. And they were stationed very close to the battlefields where they would provide snacks to the soldiers. And it was actually then where they invented the concept of the donut, and they were nicknamed the donut dollies. And so we can thank that the women of the Salvation Army for giving us donuts. We actually have the original donut recipe that these women used while they were stationed at the battlefields in Europe. So yeah, yep. I mean, we tell those stories too, because right before the women were officially a part or in the Women's Army Corps, they served in lots of other support roles through civilian welfare organizations like the Salvation Army or as Army nurses. Yes, the civilian welfare organizations were also in Vietnam. The Army Nurse Corps was primarily the largest group that was over in Vietnam, and there were units of WACs that were stationed in Vietnam as well.
All of these are potential great sources for family history research.
Yeah.
So I'll open it one more time to the class. Any last questions for our guest speaker? We'll give it a few seconds. I don't see any more in the chat box. Let's see here. DLB put down in the chat box, in World War II, they were with the Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it looks to me like all the questions have been answered, Micaela. So I'll say thank you very much once again. And before I say goodbye, I want to remind the class that the second half of class will start immediately after Micaela's done. And you're all more than welcome to stay. If you are going to leave us at this point in time, If there's anything in the chat box that you'd like to take with you, please copy the chat box before you log out, because once you log out, if you remember then that you wanted the chat box and you log back in, the chat box will be empty for you. So please copy and paste anything that you want out of the chat box now. And once again, Micaela, thank you once again for another outstanding presentation to my class. And also thank you very much for allowing us to record.
Yes, absolutely. My email's in the chat. If you have any questions, you can find us online. Thank you so much. I always love coming and presenting. These are some of my favorite stories to share. So have a great rest of your Friday, everybody.